Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. In his novel 1984, George Orwell wrote, "Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right." In this video, I'm going to take a look at how the sea level record has been rewritten. In the 1990 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they wrote, "There is no convincing evidence of an acceleration in global sea level rise during the 20th century." But by 2016, the story had become something completely different. 20th century sea level rise was extremely likely faster than during any of the 27 previous centuries. So let's take a look at how the official story went from no acceleration during the 20th century to the fastest in almost 3,000 years. We will take a look at the NASA Facts and Scientific Consensus website. In the 2018 version of their tide gauge graph, they showed no acceleration in sea level rise during the 20th century. It's pretty close to a straight line from 1870 until the end of the 1990s. But they had a problem. The tide gauge data was very different from their satellite data. The turquoise line shows their tide gauge data, but if we add the satellite data on, we see something very different. The satellite data shows sea level rise nearly twice as fast as the data from the tide gauges. NASA liked their satellite data because it supported their global warming agenda. And to resolve this discrepancy, NASA quite predictably altered the tide gauge data. Now they show the tide gauge data and the satellite data nearly identical. Their current tide gauge data shows very little sea level rise from 1950 until about 1994, when the satellites came online. And then their tide gauge graph shows a sudden increase in the rate of sea level rise right around the year 1994, which coincidentally matches the satellite data. Now let's compare the current version of their tide gauge graph to what they showed in 2018. It's easy to see the trick which NASA used to alter the data. They greatly reduced the rate of sea level rise from 1950 until 1994, and then they massively increased the rate of sea level rise to line up with the satellite data. This is fairly typical climate fraud, which we see from NASA all the time, altering the data to suit their agenda. Note that the total amount of sea level rise is still about the same, but they pushed down all the data prior to 1994 in order to get the hockey stick they wanted to see. Let's take a look at the history behind this data tampering. In 2008, NASA's James Hansen said that multi-meter sea level rise during this century was practically a dead certainty. And he predicted that the heavily populated areas of the U.S. East and Gulf coasts would be underwater. In 1988, the year which Dr. Hansen started the global warming scare before Congress, he predicted that Lower Manhattan would be underwater within 20 or 30 years. But that didn't happen. What actually happened is that sea level rise at Lower Manhattan has been slower than all of the predictions made by climate scientists. The red line shows their extreme sea level rise scenario. Then comes the high scenario, the intermediate high scenario, the intermediate scenario, the intermediate low scenario, and the low scenario. But the actual data is below the low scenario. There's been no acceleration in sea level rise at all at Lower Manhattan. There isn't one shred of evidence to support the idea that burning fossil fuels has affected the rate of sea level rise. Now let's look at the latest version of the data tampering. The different scenarios were supposed to start diverging around the year 2000, but that didn't happen. So NOAA quietly pushed the goalposts back by 20 years. Now the divergence is supposed to begin around the year 2020. The whole story about sea level and fossil fuels is completely fictional and has no basis in science or reality. But NASA and NOAA need funding, so they keep altering their sea level data to support their funding needs. Sea level rise isn't accelerating, but data tampering by government agencies is. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on climate junk science for almost 16 years. You can visit him and his family on the web at realclimatescience.com.